I have a long and hopefully detailed sew along for you today. It's the Vogue 9265. It is an out of print pattern, but it is a good one. I do highly recommend. I will be doing a standalone review of this pattern once I've made a few more, because there definitely will be more. I really love how this dress has turned out. For this sew along, I'm going to show you the alterations that I made to get the pattern looking more like the envelope line drawings. I'm going to also talk you through working with a semi-sheer, slightly more difficult or problematic fabric like the polyester chiffon georgette type of fabric that I have used. This is technically a wearable muslin for me, which is why I decided to go ahead and use a polyester fabric, even though I really dislike wearing them, because A, I wanted to see how I liked the pattern and how it fit, and B, I wanted to use something that wasn't quite so precious to me, just in case anything came out not quite how I wanted it to, and that way I could tweak that before I cut into one of my very precious and natural fibre fabrics that you can see behind me. There are lots of tips and tricks in this sew along for working with a semi-sheer outer fabric or a very floaty fabric for a very fitted bodice like this. If you're using a cotton lawn or something with a little bit more structure, you probably won't need to interline the bodice. If you're using a viscose, which is actually probably what I would recommend, especially given how drapey and large these sleeves are, it would look epic in a cotton lawn, but they would be very poofy. I would recommend interlining the bodice if you do use something like a viscose or a crepe, something very, very drapey, because it is a very structured bodice, and for the fit that I've chosen, I do think having a little bit more structure in a very drapey fabric does give you a nicer looking finished bodice. So let's get started. First thing that I've done before I've started anything else is I've ironed my pattern pieces completely flat, so that any of the little kind of like bumps and lumps that were in here have been ironed out, and I will be getting an accurate trace of my pieces. Next thing I need to do is work out what size I need. According to the top of the pattern, I'm going to need a size 18 for a 40-inch bust, between a size 12 and a 28 for a 27-inch waist, and then a size 22 for a 44-inch hip measurement. This one has got finished garment measurements, back length from base of neck, really not helpful. However, I will forgive this one a little bit more because it is a custom fit cup size, and so they have a different finished garment measurement for each of the 4 cup sizes, so there would be a lot of finished garment measurements to put on to the envelope for this one. This is an older pattern as well. As you can probably see here, I've got the size 6 to 14 because I know that I usually fall into the 12 to 14 size range because of the amount of ease that is added to these types of patterns. This to me is drawn as a very fitted bodice. I would like it to come out looking like a very fitted bodice. The largest size that I have is the size 14, so we'll have a look and see what the largest cup size or finished bust measurement is when I have worked out exactly what cup size I need to do. For the custom fit ones, there is a little diagram here which shows you where you need to measure. You need to measure over your full bust and then your upper bust, and it gives you a chart here which tells you what size you need to be tracing. So mine is there's 3 inches difference between my upper bust and my full bust, which means I need to trace C cup, which means I need to trace pieces 3 and 7. Over here we have a list of all of our pattern pieces, and if you've watched any of my sew alongs before, you know I like to go through and write out exactly what pattern pieces I need to trace, and then I'll tick them off as I go so I don't miss anything out, because ask me how I know, I have done that in the past. So 3 and 7 are my front bodice pieces. Then we have pieces 9 and 10, which is the bodice back and the bodice side back. 11 is the skirt front and back, and there is one piece for both the front and the back, which is probably why there is a centre front seam on the skirt. I don't like that. I'm going to change it, so I'm going to need to trace out that piece twice. And then the final piece is number 12, which is the sleeve. I'm going to do some alterations to that one as well, but I'm going to get them all traced out first, then I'll talk you through the alterations I want to make. Because I want to change the skirt, I'm going to need to trace out pattern piece 11 twice, and if you want to follow along with me, I would suggest you do that too. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pattern pieces to trace. So now that I've worked out what cup size I'm supposed to be tracing and what other pattern pieces I want to trace, obviously the only differences between these two garments is the length of the skirt, and it's the same pattern piece for the longer or shorter skirt. There's just a line depending on which length you want. So once I've worked out which pattern pieces I need to trace, I then need to look at the pattern pieces. So like I say, I've ironed my tissue paper nice and flat. I need to find my center front bodice piece, which is number 3 for me for the C cup. So we've got piece 3 here, and you can see here, this is to indicate the apex and this is to indicate the waistline, and you can see we've got the finished garment measurements for each corresponding body measurement on this pattern piece. For me, my bust is 40 inches and the size 14 is a 39.5-inch finished garment measurement. According to the back of the envelope, that's for a 36-inch bust, which means there's 3.5 inches of wearing ease around the bust, which I don't think would give me a fit that I would like. I want a very tight fitting bodice. I like tight fitting bodices, that is my preference. I also know that the Vogue block is pretty much drafted for my figure. I just have to add length, which there is a lengthen and shorten line on these pattern pieces. So I know that I am going to go for a size 14 for the bust. And then down here at this next registration mark here, which is the waistline, we have the finished garment measurements for the waist. My waist is 27 inches, so that would put me between a size 12 and 14 on the pattern envelope. The size 12 has a finished garment measurement of 29 inches, and according to this, 26.5 inches. So again, 3.5 inches of ease over the whole bodice. I don't like that. That would be way too big for my preferences for how I like my garments to fit. However, the size 10 is a 27-inch finished measurement, which would be very tight on me. There's 0 ease if I went for that measurement. So I'm actually going to go for a size 12 at the waist. For the hips, so we've got the registration mark there, and for the size 12 it's a 52-inch finished measurement. According to the pattern envelope, I should be doing a size 20 for a 44-inch hip, and size 12 is for a 36-inch hip. So that's 16 inches of ease that they are suggesting for around the hips. This is going to give me 8 inches of ease around the hips, which is fine. I'm okay with that. I think it's still going to look nice, it's going to flow, it's going to be a silhouette that I like. So rather than trying immediately grade from the size 12 waist out to a size 14 over the hips, I'm just going to do a straight size 12 for the hips because it is a very full skirt. That's another reason I like very full skirts. If this was a pencil skirt, there would be a lot more grading having to go on between the hip and the waist measurement. So now that I've worked out what pattern pieces I'm tracing and what size of each piece I'm going to trace, I can now actually get to tracing. I use more plan tracing paper, which I will list in the description down below. Some people like it, some people don't. I personally really do. It isn't overly see-through. It's see-through enough for me. If it's not see-through enough for you, Swedish tracing paper is also a great option, but it is a much more expensive option. Other side of things is you don't even have to trace your patterns if you don't want to. Personally, I like to keep my original pattern intact because I would like to be able to come back to this at a later date and make this again for myself if I either lose or gain weight. If I've cut things out, then that's not possible unless I've cut it out at the largest size. There's loads of other ways of dealing with your pattern if you don't want to trace, but for me it's just an ingrained habit from the last 11 years, trace my patterns out. So I'm going to get that done next, and then I can show you the alterations. So here are all my pattern pieces traced out and cut out. I've got 2 of pattern piece 11 because I do want to change the way the skirt's put together a little bit. So I'm going to put one of these to the side as is with no changes. And then the second pattern piece 11 I'm going to make changes to. So I'm going to put that to the side for now. Then we have the sleeve. This sleeve is 15 inches at the bicep. It did have a finished garment measurement on there. That is probably not as poofy as I would like, so I'm actually going to make a change to the sleeve and slash and spread the middle to add some more volume. So I'm going to put that to the side as well. And then we have our centre front, centre back, side back. These ones all need to be changed because I need to add an inch of length to the torso of these, and there is a lengthen and shorten line in the same place across all of those pieces. I'm also going to alter the neckline a little bit in this one because it is quite high. That's the apex point there, and I just think this is going to be a little bit higher than my preference, so I'm going to lower the neckline by about 1.5 inches, I think. So I've got changes to make to all of these pieces as well. I'm going to start off with the changes to the bodice bodice pieces because those are the simplest. Then we can move on to the sleeve and then the skirt. If you guys have watched any of my sew alongs before, you've seen me do this alteration, and I do also have a mini tutorial on how to use this alteration to either lengthen or shorten your bodice pieces or pattern pieces. This works for sleeves and skirts too. So I'm going to draw myself a line on a scrap piece of paper, or 2 parallel lines on a scrap piece of paper that is 1 inch apart. So inch apart there, and then I'm going to take my pattern piece, and I have my lengthen and shorten line there, and I want to make sure that I have a perpendicular line going through the lengthen and shorten line, which I do for this one, but not this one. So you can just do like a continuation of your grain line basically. This one, I mean, to be fair, both the centre back and the centre front, the straight edge or the centre front cut on the fold, and then the centre back where the zip goes are a straight edge, so you don't necessarily have to do that. I just like having that extra registration point, so I've just put a perpendicular line through all of those pieces. I have some tape and I have my scissors, and I am going to literally cut through my lengthen and shorten line on all of those pieces. I'm going to take some of my tape, line up that cut edge with the bottom of my 1 inch parallel lines that I've drawn on my scrap piece of paper, stick that down, take my ruler and my pencil, and the perpendicular line that was drawn through that lengthen and shorten line, I'm just going to extend that up and through the 1 inch apart lines or lengthened lines on my spare piece of paper. Get some tape, and I'm going to line up the cut edge of my pattern piece with the top edge of my lengthened and shortened 1 inch apart lines, and tape that down. Then going to join up those lines. So this is the centre front that's cut on the fold, so that is a straight line. This one we're just going to kind of, if we carry that line down, we're just going to shave off like 1/8 of an inch off of the bottom, because we want that to be a nice seamless smooth line. So once that's all done, I'm going to cut that out, trim off all the excess paper, then I can work on the neckline for the centre front. So I'm going to get the rest of my pattern pieces done in the same manner, and then we can do the neckline. I've added the inch of length to every single pattern piece, which means they will all now sew together perfectly. Well, theoretically, but we're hoping for that. I don't need the side back or the centre back or the side front pieces, so those can get put to the side. But as I mentioned, I do think I want to lower this neckline a little bit. I think this is just going to be a little bit too high for my preference. So I'm going to lower this by 1.5 inches, which is actually going to end up being just 7/8 of an inch lower because of the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, to trial out for this one, because it may be slightly too high still, it might be slightly too low, but I think rather than go really low, because I can always cut more away when I come to make when I make the garment up, and if I put it on and it's still too high for me. So one thing you do want to make sure if you're going to do this alteration is that you have like a straight line here, because it's going to be cut on the fold, and then with your French curve, or you can eyeball it, you want to kind of, because we want to blend in from here basically, but the important thing is that this bit here is flat, so that you don't end up with a weird little jog when you cut this out of fabric, because this is going to be cut on the fold. So it's kind of following along the same kind of curve as we've got there, and then straight into what will be the shoulder strap kind of portion of it. So I've taken 1.5 inches off of the neckline. I am cutting off a notch, and this is a notch that will just help you line the neckline up with itself later. So I'm just going to put another notch in. It doesn't matter if it's exactly the right place, but I am going to make a note here: neckline lowered by 1.5 inches. So I haven't made a note that I've added 1 inch of length, because that's obvious to me. That is it's an alteration I do to everything, and it's also obvious because you can see that there's 1 inch of extra paper being added there. But when I've taken away, if I come back to this, I may not remember that I've done that. So I've just made myself a little note on the pattern piece here that tells me what I have done to this pattern piece, so that if I come back to this in a couple of weeks, months or years time, then I know I've lowered that neckline by 1.5 inches. If I make any changes to the pattern once I've made it up, or while I'm making the wearable muslin, then I can make notes about that on the pattern as well. Okay, so now that we've got our centre front marked up with its seam allowance, we can get out our skirt. This is the second skirt portion that I have traced. We have got the double notches here indicate the side seam, so this is the center front. This big circle here is where your zip should end, because this pattern piece is the same for both the front and the back. I don't want a center front seam in my skirt, so first thing that we need to do is mark in our seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch, because this centre front portion of the skirt is going to get cut on the fold. So we're going to be taking away this seam allowance. Done that so I can match up my centre front bodice piece, which is also cut on the fold, and see the notches for the bodice line up there. I'm going to also draw in my seam allowance along the bottom of my bodice and then on my skirt as well, because this is a slightly curved seam, and obviously it's the stitching lines that match up, not the seam allowances that match up, or the cut line that matches up. So I've literally taken my bodice piece and my stitching line, which is this line here. I've matched that up, the start point up, with the stitching line on the skirt, which is that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance line that we've just drawn, and then I'm walking those two seam lines together just to make sure that everything matches up, and then I'm putting my nail where the cross section of that seam allowance is, so 5/8 of an inch away from the side seam, and I'm just making a mark on the skirt panel. So my skirt panel from here to here now should match up perfectly with the bottom of my bodice. So it is 2 inches, 2.5, just under 2 7/8 of an inch. And yeah, they match up perfectly. I can put my front bodice piece away, I'm done with that now. So I want to put in a style line from that little mark that I made that when I've walked to the bodice to make sure that they're the same size. I've just drawn a line from that mark, that little mark I made after walking the bodice from the centre front, because we're cutting all this off. I've walked it along there and that was the mark I've made. So this is my new style line. What you could do if you want to is cut along that style line and add seam allowance both sides. Then you'd need to cut off the seam allowance here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually get another fresh piece of paper and take a tracing of this piece, and then take off the seam allowance here and add it over there. Theoretically, you don't have to add seam allowance to this side, because you've got this seam allowance over here, so you could cut this on the fold and this seam allowance would then move over to that side. Theoretically that should work. That is something that you can do, but I don't trust my brain enough for that to be perfect, so I am going to retrace it out and put seam allowance on to the new style line, rather than just trusting that this seam allowance will seamlessly move over to that one. It probably will. I'm probably overthinking it. Let me know if you do this step without adding or retracing this piece. But I'm erring on the side of caution. So I'm going to go and grab another piece of paper and trace this piece off, not cutting anything else out yet, because I'm going to still need to add seam allowance to this side for this pattern piece to make sure that these two can go back together and still give me the waist measurement that I want. So I'll show you what I mean in a sec. Okay, so I have traced out this front piece here, and I have added the seam allowance to the side, this side here, on this piece. But having traced it out, I'm now going to lie it back over top of this. And if you don't want to trace it out like I did, then the seam allowance that is the centre front seam allowance here does automatically just swing over to this side. I thought it probably would, but I wanted to double check before I told you guys, yeah, it does the thing, and it didn't do the thing. It does the thing. So I now have my new skirt front, and I'm going to cut one of those on the fold. So I'm going to put that to the side. So I still have some tweaks that I need to do to this one. This is my style line here. Okay, so we've traced this piece out. We now need to make this piece good. So we need to add seam allowance to this side of this style line so that this pattern piece has seam allowance both sides as well. So I'm going to add 5/8 of an inch down that style line that I've drawn in. So there's the style line, this is the center front, this will be the side front, and I'm going to cut out this line here so that we've got seam allowance added to both sides of this panel of the skirt. So this is now going to go in my scrap paper, and this is now my skirt side front. So I'm going to make a note of what I've done. So we've got skirt side front, pattern piece 11 of the Vogue 9265. It is a size 12 and we need to cut 2 of these off our fabric. Okay, so I've got all my details on that. So we now have a 3 pattern piece skirt pattern. I've just turned this one this way around so that the side seams match up. So we're going to need to cut one of our skirt front, our new skirt front, on the fold, which I have put on my pattern piece. I've written it on my pattern piece just out of shot. So yeah, I've written it up here. Vogue 9265 skirt front, cut 1 on fold, size 12, and I have kept the notch that corresponds with the notch on the bodice. I've also got mine cut on the fold line so that I know which side is which. We've then got my skirt side front, size 12, cut 2 of these of the fabric, and again all of the details are there. Technically these two added together should add up to what is now our skirt back piece. So if I lay these on top of each other, so yeah, you can see there our seam allowances are overlapping, and we've lost our seam allowance over here because this is going to be cut with the centre back seam, but this one's going to be cut on the fold. So that's the skirt front done. This is now our skirt back panel, but you can do something and save yourself 2 lines of stitching. This dress is fully lined. That's what the pattern recommends for the bodice and the skirt, and I'm going to go through with that for the bodice and the skirt because I do like how that looks, and the fabric I'm using for my wearable muslin is a polyester. So I'm going to use a viscose Marrakein for the lining of this. To save yourself that extra two lines of sewing for the extra panel that we've put into the front, for this one I've got cut 2 fabric, cut 4 lining. So we can use this pattern piece, which is larger and will have less seams in it, for our lining. So you will have a centre front seam on your lining piece. If your fabric that you're using is sheer and you don't want a centre front seam down your lining, just use your other 2 pattern pieces to cut your lining pieces out and cut 2 of this. But if you have an opaque fabric, you can cut 4 of your lining pieces from this big piece, and that just saves you a couple of lines of stitching when you're putting your skirt pieces together. The last alteration I want to do is to my sleeve. As I mentioned, I like a very full sleeve, a very fluty, flowy sleeve, and I don't think this one is going to have enough floof for my preference. So what I'm doing here is, rather than a large circle which denotes the shoulder seam, I put in a notch because I just find that easier to interpret when I am making my pattern pieces up. And I am lining up my ruler with that center notch and then also the grain line so that it is a nice straight line down the center of my pattern. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did when I was lengthening my pattern pieces. I want a perpendicular line through that piece because I'm going to cut right down the center and add in 2 inches, and we can do that with our offcut of our skirt. That is long enough and wide enough to do that, yes. So my ruler is 2 inches wide, and I just want to add 2 inches of width to my sleeve because I do like a super floofy sleeve. So it's the same process as the lengthening and shortening, just vertical rather than horizontal. So I've got my lines 2 inches apart this time rather than 1 inch. I'm going to take my sleeve pattern and cut all the way down my pattern piece. Okay, so I'm going to take the cut edge of my pattern piece and line it up with the first line of my 2 inch wide parallel lines, making sure it's nice and straight the whole way along. So get that to tape down from top to bottom. Then, to make sure that everything is going to line up nicely, that perpendicular line, I'm going to carry that through my parallel lines that are adding the width to the pattern. Take my other pattern piece, line the cut edge up with that other parallel line, making sure that the perpendicular line is nicely matched, which this one is. tape that down. So this isn't adding a lot of floof to the bottom of the sleeve, which as you can see is already quite large, but what it is doing is adding 2 inches of extra floof at the top of the sleeve cap. I really like how that looks, and I tend to put in my gathering stitches quite and pull them quite densely so that the excess is always really concentrated at the top of my sleeve. If you can see here, the 2 dots where you're to gather from and to, they're just obviously now 2 inches further apart. I will probably end up moving those in so that there is an extra concentrated bit of gathering right at the sleeve cap. I like how that looks. It might not be for you. No worries if you don't particularly want to do that. So I'm just joining up those last 2 bits. So obviously now my notch is split in half, but we know I've added 2 inches. So the new notch is going to be right in the middle of that. So 1 inch in from either side, and that is now where my sleeve will meet up with the shoulder part of the bodice once I've sewn it. So I'm just going to cut this out, get rid of all of the excess paper because we don't need lots of extra floops. Again, I'm not necessarily going to add like a note to this because it's very obvious what I've done, but if you do trace this out again because you don't like having pattern pieces with lots of tape on them, then you do want to make a note of any changes that you've made. The other thing that I'm doing is I have a project book, and I am going to write down the title of this project, the sizes that I've traced, the finished garment measurements according to the pattern, and then any alterations that I've made to it. I'm also going to note what fabric I've used, how much fabric I've used, just so that I have kind of like a more detailed record of this pattern when I come to do the review, because there's going to be at least 2 of these made, probably more, because I do think I'm going to like this dress a lot. So it would be nice to be able to go back and look at the very first one that I've made and any notes that I make whilst I'm sewing it and altering it and changing everything up. But that is the last pattern alteration that I've done, so I'm going to get everything cut out.
First quick note just to mention, because I didn't mention it in the pattern alteration segment, I haven't changed the grain line on any of the skirt pieces other than probably the centre front one, which does have to be cut on the fold, which obviously dictates its grain line. The other thing I wanted to mention is you're watching me cut out the outer fabric here. This is a poly georgette, poly chiffon fabric I got years ago from Lady McElroy because I fell in love with the print. I don't overly love polyester fabric to work with or wear, but I thought it was worth using this one for a wearable muslin because it would make a very pretty dress, and it would let me know if I like the dress or not, which, spoiler alert, I do. The parts that you don't see me cutting out are the lining parts. For the bodice, I cut out a interlining and lining layer of cotton lawn. That was basically all 4 bodice pieces cut out twice of cotton lawn. And for the skirt lining, I used a viscose Maricane that I get from the fabric room, and I will link to in the description down below. I really like it because it's inexpensive, it's easy to use, and it makes a lovely floaty lining for a fuller skirt like this, although the skirt isn't quite as full as I think the pattern envelope would have you believe. We can change that in the future though. I have the lovely Patreon peeps to thank for this particular pattern. The $5 and up tiers get to vote on patterns that will be featured in sew-alongs. They picked this one out for me quite a few months ago, and I'm very grateful that they did. You can see a long list of all their names floating up the side of the screen at the moment, but I do have a lot of new patrons to say hello to. So without further ado, thank you and welcome to Lindsay, Georgina Cox, Caroline Gillam, Flamingo Tango, Lynn French, Renata, Annie Pyron, Patricia Hickey, Shona McLaughlin, Monica Goulart, Anita Murray, Sandra Kelly, Suzanne Wilkes, Sarah Hyde, Alison H, Jean Linda, Chris Urello, Bobby, Knitting Mummy Amanda, Susan Visser, Joker Cleese, Larry, Fiona Christie, Chris, Donna Stiles, Claire CJ, Stephanie Smuts, Daniela Ray, Stephanie Curran, Saturday's Child, Shorty, Mrs. KK, Samantha, Angelica Lindholm, Felicity Lemon, Ainsley Woods, Janet Heisler, Sue Hall, Jenny Lee Cookman, Caroline Stromberg, Ellie Jones, April, Marilyn S, Nicola, Elena, Anka Mastia, Luminaria Stormreaver, and I'm so sorry for the pronunciation on this one, Adri PC. I also have some coffees to say thank you for from the very lovely Claire Curtis, Maeve Fanning, Gingerhead & Co, and especially to the lovely Helen Barker who bought me 100 coffees. Yes, you heard me right, 100 coffees in one go. Thank you so much to Helen, to all of the people who bought me coffees, and to everybody that signed up for Patreon. I definitely could not and would not be making videos like this and running the channel the way that I do without your continued support. Thank you so much.
We definitely have some nice easy instructions. There is one singular sided page of them. I, however, am going to be difficult and start at instruction number 6, which is for making the skirt. I want to do that because this skirt does have a lot of bias in its hem, and I would like to hang up both my skirt and skirt lining so that they can do their biasy thing and drop whilst I'm making the bodice and the sleeves. So as you saw in the pattern altering section, I did actually put in a center front cut on the fold, so I panelled the center front part of this skirt because I didn't want a center front seam in my dress, and I was going to cut my lining out of the original pattern pieces and just cut 4, but my fabric is sheer enough that that line of stitching for that center front seam of the lining would have shown through, so I've cut my lining pieces with the center front alterations that I've made as well. I have all my pieces here, so that's my skirt side front. This is my skirt front, and then this is the back piece, which is the original piece. So I'm going to put that to the side, and I'm going to work with the pieces that I altered. So we've got my skirt front piece here that's cut, one of them cut on the fold. So I can take that off of the fabric and put the pattern piece away. And then we have here skirt side front. Now the double notches are for the side seam, so I actually haven't included notches in my new pattern piece. You can if you would like to, but what we're going to do is sew this seam here without the notches to the center front panel, and I'm going to do it with French seams. So I'm going to get it all pinned together, wrong sides together, not that there is a right or wrong side with this fabric, but obviously there will be with the outer fabric, and sew those at 1/4 of an inch to start. So that's the first passes of my French seams sewn. Just put a little pin next to the double notches just so that I could 100% remember which side was which and didn't start pinning the wrong side and then get to the double notch and have to unpin everything. It's just a little trick I use to like really highlight which side of the fabric is which once I've taken the pattern piece off. So now we need the back of our skirt, and I'm going to do the same thing. So we've got the double notches up here, and then the back of the skirt I'm just going to put an orange pin on what I'm classing as the right side. Obviously that doesn't really matter with the fabric I'm using at the moment, but again it will with the fashion fabric when we make the skirt outer. So I've just put in a little orange pin to signify that this is the back of the skirt, and this edge I'm going to finish with bias binding. This is the edge with the double notch, again just to highlight where your double notch is. I'm going to put in yellow pins that will match up with the yellow pins in the other skirt pieces that I've made, and I'm going to sew these panels to the front panels at 1/4 of an inch with the wrong sides together technically, so that I can get these seams French seamed or started to be French seamed as well. I've got the first pass of all my French seams sewn, and now I am going to trim that seam allowance down. So I've sewn them all at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to trim them so that they are just under 1/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to go and press everything, and I will press the seam to the side first, and then I will turn the fabric so the fabric is right sides together and press the seam to enclose the raw edge for the final part of stitching the French seam, but trimming first. French seams all trimmed, and now I'm going to go and press. I have finished off the back edges of my skirt with bias binding. I have finished up my French seams by sewing them at 3/8 of an inch, and then I have pressed these two seams towards one edge and then those two seams in the opposite way so that they are all facing towards the back of the skirt currently, but dress when it's finished. So I'm now going to go and use a grippy hanger to hang this up so that the bias can start doing its thing, and I can start working on the outer layer of the skirt. I'm just going to need to change thread colour to do that. We need to repeat all of those processes with the main fashion fabric. So we are going to sew the centre front panel to the side front panels, wrong sides together, because again we are going to French seam this fabric. So I have done the same thing that I did last time, put a pin next to the double notches. The double notches are the side seams, so it's this side that gets sewn to this side. So I'm going to get that pinned into place, wrong sides together and sewn at 1/4 inch.
I do have a whole playlist of different French seam applications, one of which is for inseam French seamed pockets. I don't tend to include pockets in lightweight fabrics like this one. For this one, the pocket bag would have been visible through the fabric. And I also don't overly like pockets in very lightweight fabrics, as I feel that they can be distorted when you put things in them. And I put a lot of things in my pockets. So if you would like to include pockets and you are using something like a cotton lawn or a slightly heavier weight fabric, I will link to and list down below the inseam French seam pocket tutorial, as well as the other mini tutorials for all things French seams.
I have trimmed all the excess seam allowance off of all of the seams that I have sewn, so they're all at 1/8 inch. I'm going to go and press them flat, then press them with the right sides together so that I can sew them at 3/8 inch. And I'm also going to finish the centre back seam with some bias binding that I made earlier. This fabric is polyester, so this was not the most fun I have ever had, but I surprisingly have managed to get it to hold a crease, which bodes well for the dress. Wish me luck. I have finished off my seams. They are a little bit fuzzy. This fabric frays the second you look at it, so I'm going to go through when the dress is finished and just give them a little bit of a trim and get rid of any of the fuzzy threads. But it's not super obvious, but there's just the occasional couple like this. But like I said, this fabric literally frays the second you look at it. I've also bound the edges with the matching bias binding. As much of a pain as it was to make this bias binding, I'm really glad that I did, because I think if I'd used a stark white or even like a bluey grey colour like this, I think it would have been super obvious, because this fabric is just that little bit sheer. I've bound the centre back edges of the skirt, and now I've got it on one of my pinchy hangers so that both the lining and the skirt can hang and drop on the bias whilst I make the bodice and the sleeves. Another thing that I prefer to do is have my sleeves ready to go before I start working on the bodice. In my head it just makes things go quicker. I know this is not the actual case. So the next step that we're going to go to is number 14, and the first thing that it wants us to do is ease stitch between the small circles at the top of the sleeve cap. If you're following along with me, you know that I've added 2 inches of width to the sleeve. So this is actually going to be a gathering stitch, not an ease stitch. There is going to be poof and gathering at the top of the sleeve cap, which is something that I prefer. If you haven't added the width in here, you will still need to put your 2 lines of ease stitching in, and I like to do that with the longest stitch length my machine will do, and then I do one 3/8 inch away from the raw edge and then 3/8 inch away from that. I'll show you when I've done it. The reason I do that is because I find that you get better gathers or better kind of control over the amount of ease if you have gathering stitching either side of your stitching line. This method will put a line of stitching visible onto the body of the garment that you will be able to see once it's finished. Obviously we'll remove it, but if your fabric is very delicate and doesn't recover well from having holes made in it through the needle, then you might want to consider something else for the ease stitching or gathering around the sleeve cap. So 2 lines of ease stitching, 1 3/8 inch away from the raw edge, 1 3/8 inch away from that, and again I'll show you what that looks like when I've done it. Hopefully you can see that I've got 2 lines of gathering stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the cut edge and then 3/8 of an inch away from that, so the 5/8 of an inch seam line is right in the middle there. So now that the top of the sleeve is prepared, I can actually sew the rest of the sleeve up. So I am going to finish my underarm seam with French seams. So I'm going to pin this together, right sides together, and sew at 1/4 of an inch. Okay, I have the first part of the French seam sewn. Now I am going to trim that down so that I can press it flat, press it with the right sides together, and sew at 3/8 of an inch to finish off the French seam. I got cold again, so I've put my dressing gown on. Okay, so I have finished off the French seam by sewing it at 3/8 of an inch, and then I've pressed it towards the back, and you can tell it's the back because of the double notch. So the next thing that we need to do is finish off the hem of the sleeve. Now if we're following along with the instructions, we'd need to be going to instruction 16, which is to form casing for elastic, turn 5/8 of an inch to inside on lower edge of sleeve, turn in by 1/4 of an inch on the raw edge, press and stitch, leaving an opening to insert the elastic. You can do that. This is a curved and quite a curved hem, so that will end up with some puckering if you do it that way, which is totally fine because we're going to be putting elastic in it. And if you had a fabric that pressed well and easily, I would recommend that. So you're literally pressing up the edge by 5/8 of an inch and then pressing under that raw edge by 1/4 of an inch, so you're creating a 3/8 of an inch channel for your elastic to go through. I am using a polyester fabric because it's a really pretty print and I bought it way before I stopped buying polyester fabrics, but it does mean that it doesn't press super well. It presses okay, but it's not going to be the easiest thing to do this hem in that manner. So I'm going to use the bias binding that I made earlier, which I have pressed and has pressed quite well, but that's because I could do it really slowly. It was a flat surface and I could use my clapper on it, which again I can do with the hem of the sleeve, but it's not going to be the easiest thing. So I'm going to use my bias binding and we're going to end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So it is going to give us a wider channel than the method that the pattern would call for, which you may or may not like, but I'm also using slightly wider elastic than the pattern calls for. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'll put this one to the side for now. First thing that I'm going to do is make sure that my sleeve is the right way out. And this isn't the easiest thing to tell because of this fabric, but you will be able to tell that your sleeve is the right way out because the seam will be on the inside. So I've got the right side of the fabric and I actually have a join in my bias binding right at the end, so I'm going to actually cut that off just because I want as few joins as possible. So I'm going to take the right side of my binding, which is the side which has got the folded edges on it. For me, this is the wrong side of the binding, the bit with the raw edges visible. This is the right side of the binding, and I'm going to start about 2 inches away from the French seam, and I'm going to give myself like a 2-inch tail of the bias binding as well. So with right sides together, I'm going to sew all the way around until I get to about 2 inches away from the bias binding where I've started sewing it, or right to the free flapping edge, and stop sewing there, and I'll show you what that looks like. I have started sewing about 2 inches away from the underarm seam, and I've left myself a 2-inch tail on the bias binding. I've sewn it all the way around until I've got about a 2-inch gap, and I've backstitched there. So I want to finish my bias binding by putting in another join. So I'm going to unfold the bias binding, and again, this would be way easier with a fabric that presses well. This is one of the reasons that I do not like working with polyester. So I'm going to attempt to kind of finger press, which is really probably not going to work very well, but a 45-degree angle in, and then keeping the other side of the binding lying flat, opening it up and butting it up against that 45-degree angle, and I'm gonna again try and sort of finger press that into place. So basically the same way that you make most bias binding is by sewing the strips together at 45-degree angles, and it just gives you a really nice seamless, or well, there is a seam, but like continuous finish. There is another way of doing it, and I do have a video on my channel for finishing a hem with bias binding where I just overlap it. You can totally do that, but it does add a little bit more bulk. Hopefully there is a little bit of a crease there that I can see just about. So I'm going to put my pin in at the crease on both sides, which it's not overly obvious here, but it's about there. Again, if you're using a fabric that actually presses well, this will be much easier. But I've pinned my 45-degree angle in, and I'm just going to pull everything a little bit taut, so to see if that kind of lines up, and it does. So I'm going to sew this, trim off the excess, and then we can sew the rest of the binding into place. Okay, so before you trim anything off, you want to just kind of lie everything out flat and make sure that there isn't like a bulge or a gap there. You can err on the side of it sewing it a little tighter because this is bias binding, so it inherently has a little bit of stretch in it. You want to err on the side of too tight rather than too loose, because too loose you'll end up with a sort of unsightly like bulge on the fabric, which again you can get around because you can press it, and if it's a fabric that presses well, you can press it and make it kind of work. So it is kind of forgiving this step, but I personally would err on the side of a little too tight rather than a little too loose. So I'm trimming off all the excess pieces of fabric so that I can go in and with the seam allowance open, just sew that last sort of 2 inches of bias binding to the sleeve hem, and then we can go and press this. I have pressed all of the seam allowance down into the bias binding, and then I've pressed the bias binding the whole way over so that the entirety of the bias binding is on the inside of the sleeve, and I have pressed it, believe it or not, but that seam is still very bouncy. I'm now going to sew from the underarm seam, back stitching there all the way around until about 1 inch away from the initial line of sewing, because obviously we need to leave a gap for our elastic to be threaded through. I'm going to do that with an edge stitch foot, and I'm going to raise my stitch length up to 3.5 so it's a little bit more decorative rather than the construction stitch length. I just prefer that for visible top stitching. So I'm going to get that done, and as I say, leave 1 inch gap so that there is room to put the elastic through. You should end up with something, if you're following along with me, that looks like this. I have my gap there for threading my elastic through, and I have a nice wide channel, so I could use wider elastic than I am. I could use a lot wider elastic than I am, but this is the widest elastic that I have in stock that isn't 2 inches wide, which obviously wouldn't fit. And I don't actually mind kind of like that extra chunky look at the bottom. I don't mind that. So again, you might want to adjust your bias binding width to the width of your elastic, or make sure that you have the correct width of elastic in stock. You need to look at step 17. Cut 2 pieces of elastic, each measurement of elbow plus 1 inch. Insert elastic through casing, lap ends, hold with safety pin, try on dress and adjust if necessary. Stitch ends of elastic securely. Okay, so I can kind of understand why they put the sleeves on last, because you can obviously try the dress on and decide where you want your sleeves to sit. I have measured the elastic around just above my elbow. I'm really cold today, which is why I've got so many layers on, but I rolled up my sleeve so it was nice and flat, and then put the elastic around just above the elbow, and then held it slightly. There was a slight amount of tension on it, not loads, because you don't want this to dig in. That gets really uncomfortable in the long term. Ask me how I know. So I've just overlapped it by 1 inch, and I have put on my safety pin. So I'm going to feed my elastic through the channel, the opening of the channel that I've left. Now you can, if you're worried about losing the end of this, you can safety pin this to the French seam just so that it stays in place and you can't pull it too far through. Again, that's really frustrating. Ask me how I know. But it's quite long, so I didn't do it with the other one and I got away with it. So let's see if I can get away with it now. So I've threaded the elastic through, and I've got like a 4-inch tail hanging out there. So now I'm just going to thread the elastic. I'm not going to pull on the elastic anymore. I'm going to thread the fabric over the elastic that's in the channel so that I maintain that 4-inch tail. Fingers crossed this works. So background to the start. You will just need to be careful of any joins because you don't want to get the end of your safety pin caught into those joins. So when you get the safety pin, pull it through, take the safety pin off. You want to make sure that it's not twisted. You're going to overlap the ends of the elastic by 1/2 inch, and then you're going to sew back and forwards over this with a zigzag stitch to secure that into place. So I've secured that into place. Now you're just going to feed the elastic through the entire channel so it's kind of evenly spaced. Once you've got it all in there, you want to flatten out the little area where you left the opening and just stitch that into place, back stitching at the beginning and the end to close up that gap, and then the sleeves are finished. Sleeves are complete. Now we can go back to step 1 of the instructions, except that we have a few extra things to do, especially if you're following along with me. I'm going to put this to the side and grab my bodice pattern pieces. Before I took all the pins out, I have marked in my notches, and I've just done that with small snips into the seam allowance. That's just my preferred way of marking notches. You can do tailor's tacks, you can mark triangles outwards, you can do it with pen or pencil, as long as it's 1, removable if it will be seen, and 2, doesn't disappear too quickly because you are going to be handling these pieces. So the other thing I'm doing is I'm using a very flimsy and floaty outer fabric. Got my bodice side front here. So this is the right side and that's the wrong side. So I've got 2 of my outer, and then I have 4 of my lining fabric, and I'm using a cotton lawn for this. Now I've got 4 because I'm going to interline this fabric. Like I say, it's very kind of shifty and lightweight, and also it's sheer enough that the seam allowance would show through the fabric if I didn't interline it. So I've got, like I say, 2 sets. There's 2 here and 2 here. 2 sets of my lining fabrics, and I am going to interline these bodice pieces. Now you can do this by hand, you can baste these into place by hand, or you can do what I'm going to do and do it by machine. Now the outer fabric, as you can see, is kind of like all over the place and doesn't want to stay in shape. So you're going to have to very carefully line up the cut edges and pin this into place. One way of doing this, if you are a bit worried about accuracy, is you can cut out your interlining pieces, so your cotton lawn pieces of the correct shape, and pin them to a rough, bigger than what you need piece of outer fabric. Pin it into place, sew around the cotton lining within the seam allowance, and then trim down the outer fabric to fit. I didn't have enough fabric to do that and still make the bias binding that I wanted to, so I've cut them exactly to size. So I'm really carefully going to go round, and the nice thing about this is the fabrics want to stick to each other, so it should be fairly easy to kind of get them back to fitting together. You want to do it flat, don't do it like held up in the air, because gravity can try and distort things for you, which we don't want. You want to make sure that your notches are matching up, which those ones are. We're just going around and pinning this into place. Like I say, you can totally hand baste this if you don't want to do it under the machine. It's completely up to you. I am going to do it by machine because it's quicker, and I'm not a huge fan of hand sewing when I don't have to. But the way I'm going to do it is, rather than sew around this from here and go all the way around, that can really distort the fabric. So what I'm going to do is, without back stitching, I'm going to start here and sew right down and off of the end, and then I'm going to go over to this side, so I'm doing the parallel seam, and I'm going to sew from the top down all the way down to the bottom there. Then I will sew the underarm seam and the waist seam down. That way I'm not kind of distorting and pushing the fabric around and making it twist. I found this works really well. I'm going to try it out with these 2 pieces. If it gets really twisted and unruly, then I will go to hand basting. But if I can make this work, which I think I can because I've had success with it in the past, I'm going to machine baste everything together, which we'll need to be doing for your side front, your centre front, your side back and your centre back pieces. So you'll have 1, 2, 3 for your front and 4 for your back. back that you will need to baste into place if you're interlining things like I am. If you're using a viscose fabric for this, rather, I mean, I'm using like a polyester Georgette chiffony fabric for my outer, which is definitely very, very drapey. If you're using a viscose, you might want to consider interlining it as well. If you're using a cotton lawn, you probably won't, unless it's really see-through, you probably won't need to interline your cotton lawn fabric because it will have enough structure to hold the bodice and do what you want it to do. Right, so I have my second piece, and again, if your right sides and wrong sides are not quite as obvious as you would perhaps like, I can tell this is the right side because this is clearer and denser in colour, this particular part of the print, than the other side. This is just a little bit more kind of blurry at the edges. If you don't have like a obvious right and wrong side of your outer fabric, you're using a solid for example, you also want to make sure that you're giving yourself mirrored pieces, not two of the same. Again, ask me how I know. So I'm going to get this one pinned into place and then I will baste it, and I'm basting within the seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch for this pattern, so I'll be basting it 3/8 of an inch, and I'll do it, like I say, without back stitching from here right down to sew off the end, again in the same direction from the top down to the end without back stitching, and then I will do the waist seam and the underarm seam, and obviously the same for every other piece. I will show you how this looks in just a second. I have all my pieces basted together, and so I'm now going to treat them as one single layer of fabric. The first instruction is to stay stitch side edges of bodice front between the notches. You've got a notch here and then a notch up here, so one there and one there on both sides, so there and there as well. They want you to stay stitched between those pieces. Now, because I have put in this basting stitching which is holding my two layers of fabric together, I don't need to stay stitch because I've already done that. The stay stitching is to reinforce this area because you're going to be sewing a princess seam, which is a convex curve to a concave curve. Don't ask me which one is which because I have no idea, but that is step number 2. Pin bodice side front sections to front, clipping front wherever necessary, and stitch. So basically we're going to match up the bottom edge and the notches, and I like to sew from the side that doesn't have the, so like the side with the shorter curve, as it were, because we're having to kind of like bring this one around to fit onto this curve. So this curve's going to stay flat, but this is the one that's going to end up with some puckering. Now I know some people prefer to do it the other way, but I much prefer to sew with this side up so that I can make sure that I'm not getting any tucks or gathers in my stitching line as I'm stitching. So I am pinning this together, matching up the 2 notches first, and then obviously the waistline seam, and then we need to ease all of this fabric into the flat curve underneath. So you're going to need a lot of pins, and what you can do if you need to is clip into and up to your line of stay stitching or the basting stitching, just to give you slightly more fabric to go around that curve. This is looking like it's actually going to pin in quite nicely. Some princess seams are worse to do than others. I think this one's actually going to behave itself quite nicely. What you want to remember is that you are matching up the stitching lines, not the cut edges, and so you want to, if you need to draw in the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so that you can match up those stitching lines a little bit easier, that is something that can help. But that's gone in actually fairly nicely and without too many pins. So as you can see, this underneath part is going to stay flat, and this top part here is the one that's going to end up with all the kind of like bumps and wrinkles in it. So we're going to sew from the underarm edge here down to the waist seam at 5/8 of an inch, and you want to make sure when you're doing that that you don't sew in any tucks or puckers around this princess seam, and that's why I like having this piece of fabric on top, so that I can just maneuver things, keep the needle down, raise the presser foot up, smooth the fabric out, and keep going so that I don't end up with any puckers. I also like to pin as much as I possibly can in one go, so I'm going to pin the other side together in the same manner, and I'm also going to do the same for my lining pieces. Okay, it doesn't say anything about pressing at this stage, but you do want to press. You can see from the illustrations here that they've pressed the seams open, which is what I would suggest as well. So my bodice front is looking like this at the moment, and I will need to clip into these curves so that I can press these seams flat, and I'm going to do that between the notches on both sides, and again the same for the lining. I'm making the lining at the same time as I'm making the outer. I don't like the pattern instructions that get you to the end of making the bodice and then say, and now repeat for the lining. You may as well do the same steps for the outer as you're doing for the lining at the same time. There are lots of opinions about clipping. Some people don't like it because they feel that it weakens the fabric. Some people don't like it because it looks, if your fabric is a little bit sheer or lighter, you can see the clips underneath the fabric on the outer garment when it's finished. So there are different things that you can do. I'm going to clip because with all the layers that I've got going on, I don't think that those clips are going to be obvious underneath my outer fabric. That's one of the reasons that I've interlined it. If I hadn't interlined it, those clips would be super obvious. I'm also putting another layer of cotton lawn underneath of this as well, so I don't think that the clips are going to be visible through my fabric on my finished garment. If your fabric is somewhat sheer or see-through and you're not interlining it, what you can do is trim really close to, so you're just about 1/4 of an inch, just under 1/4 of an inch the whole way along your seam allowance, and then press it to one side. That looks really neat and nicely finished under a slightly sheer fabric if you've got like a lighter fabric, for example. Something else you can do if you're worried about your fabric fraying, because this chiffon-y thing that I'm using frays the second that you look at it, and so I would be really worried about trimming my seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch with this, especially in this area, because this is a tight-fitting bodice. Having the garment remain intact, something you could do if you were worried about that, use pinking shears to trim close to the edge, because that notches it for you, but it also helps to stop fabric from just fraying away to nothing, because the pinking shears cut the fabric on the bias, and so that is something that's less likely to fray. But like I say, for me, I am just going to cut notches carefully into the seam allowance from notch to notch along the princess seams of both my outer and my lining fabric, and then I'm going to go over to the ironing board with my pressing ham and press these seams open. And you will need a pressing ham to be able to press these curved edges neatly, and I'll link my pressing ham, the one that I have, which is from Amazon and cost I think £10, and it's something that you really want to have. Pressing is half the battle with home sewing to make it look good. So yeah, I'm going to go press those open once I've notched the princess seams in the same place on my lining, and then we can move on to sewing up the back panels. We are on to step number 3, stay stitch side edges of bodice back. Well, again, I don't need to do that because I have basted everything into place, so that's basically working as stay stitching as well. Once you have done that, if you haven't pre-basted your fabric and you're basting the entirety of that princess seam, you're going to attach your side back to your back in the same manner that we did with the last ones, and again you want to do the same for your lining as you are for the outer pieces. So we are going to, there is a notch at the top, there's only a singular notch on this back princess seam, so you're going to pin that into place, get the seam allowances to, again, the 5/8 of an inch stitching line to match up at the top, match the waistline up, and then pin all the way around. Again, I want to sew from this side because this is the side that needs to curve in to fit onto that princess curve there, and you're going to do the same for the lining. I actually didn't stay stitch the lining front pieces. I found that I didn't need to, and so I'm not going to stay stitch the back. I'm using a fairly stable cotton lawn for my linings. If you're using something like a viscose, then you probably will want to stay stitch your lining, because viscose can get out of or off grain very easily, especially when you're having to kind of manipulate seams around curves like this. But anyway, I am going to get these pinned, get the linings pinned, and get these seams sewn together so we can then press it and then sew together the shoulder seams. I have clipped the curves and pressed these seams flat as well, and I've done the same for the lining. The next thing that the pattern would like you to do is stitch bodice back sections to bodice front at shoulder and sides. I want to do mine slightly differently. They actually get you to construct the whole dress, put the zip in and then put the lining in. I don't want to do mine that way. I prefer putting the zip in last once the dress is fully lined. Also, that means that I'm going to be able to finish or bag out the arm side when I have put the sleeves in. So what I want to do next is I'm actually just going to be sewing the shoulder seams, and I'm going to do that for the outer and the lining. I want to leave the side seams open for now. We will be sewing them very soon, but if I sew the shoulder seams then I can do the neckline, then I can clip and understitch the neckline with everything flat, then sew the side seams, and that just makes doing the neckline area that little bit easier. If everything is sewn together, it's still possible to do, it's just a little bit more kind of fiddly having to move everything around, whereas everything is still flat, much easier. So shoulder seams together, and you want to make sure, let's get this out of the way, that when you sew shoulder seams together, you've got the center backs together, and then you're going to line up the shoulder seams right sides together, and we're going to sew those at 5/8 of an inch. Do the same for the lining. I have got the shoulder seams sewn together and I have pressed them open, and I've done the same for the outer and the lining. And so now what we want to do, or if you want to follow along with me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the neckline together for the lining and the outer. I am going to stop about 2.5–3 inches away from the centre back edge, and I'm going to put in an orange pin. For me, I use color-coded pins to mark stopping points. You can do like a double pin here if that's the system that works for you, because I want to be able to sandwich my zip in between my outer and lining fabric, and I won't be putting my zip in for quite a while yet, so I just want to leave that little bit open. So I'll pin that in first, then I will match up the shoulder seams, pin those. You want to make sure that your seam allowances are pinned open so that when you sew over it, it doesn't kind of turn back and catch on itself. Then we're going to pin into and around the rest of the neckline, and we're going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch. And as I said, we're going to stop a couple of inches away from the centre back edge on each side. So I'll get this pinned and sewn, and then I'll show you what we do next. I've got my neckline sewn, and as I mentioned, I have left a gap at the centre back edges for putting the zip in later. So the next thing I need to do is clip into the curves, because that will help this to turn and be finished nicely. So I want to clip in around the back neckline up to the shoulder seam, and then this is quite a curved neckline the whole way around, so I'm going to literally clip everything. Once I've done that, I can then understitch, and I will show you what I do with that once I've done all the clipping. So once the entire neckline is clipped, we're then going to fold the lining fabric back, and as you can see, hopefully there, you can see all of the seam allowance is towards the lining side, so all of the seam allowance from the outer fabric and the lining seam allowance is all onto the lining side. I don't like to press this before I understitch. I think understitching whilst gently pulling on the fabric to make sure that the seam is lying flat helps to press this neckline to be flatter after it's been understitched. If you want to though, you can go and press all of the seam allowance towards the lining, then understitch, and then press it with the wrong sides of the lining and the outer fabrics together. Something else you need to bear in mind is, because we've left this 2 inches open, you want to start your understitching around 2 inches away from that stopping point. So you don't want to understitch this piece here, because that will make it impossible for us to get back in here and sew this shut once the zip is in. So I'm going to start my understitching 2 inches away from the open part of the back neckline, and I'm going to stop 2 inches away from the other side as well. I am going to move my needle over 1 tick to the right, just to make sure that I am catching all of this seam allowance and sewing all of that seam allowance to the lining. I'm just going to very gently spread the fabric as I go around, especially around the curves, to make sure everything that lies nice and flatly. And I'm going to be stitching 1/8 of an inch, or just under 1/8 of an inch, away from this seam line here. So I'm going to get that done, show you what it looks like, and then I can get it pressed. Hopefully you can see there I have done my understitching, securing all of my seam allowance to my lining. I have started about probably a little bit less, an inch, just over an inch away from the gap that I have left to put the zip in, and I've gone the whole way around. So I'm now going to go and press this flat like that towards the lining, and then I'm going to roll it over, and I will be pressing from the lining side, and I want to see a teeny tiny amount of the outer fabric when I'm pressing it, so that it's definitely 100% not visible on the outside. I'm really happy with how that neckline has turned out. So the next thing that we are going to do is sew together the side seams. So you need to make sure that you're not catching your lining when you're doing this, because we're going to put right sides together of our outer fabric without twisting anything. So you want to make sure that the armhole is still an armhole, and we're going to pin that together and sew that at 5/8 of an inch, and you want to repeat that for the other side and also the lining pieces. So I'm going to get that done and get those pressed open, and then we can start putting in our sleeves. You should end up with something that is looking very much like a bodice. Now is a really good time to try this on. This is wearable muslin for me. I am putting this much effort into it because I know the Vogue block fits me quite well, but I haven't tried it on yet, so I'm going to do that. But just to give you a quick look, I did sew both the side seams for the lining and the outer together, and then I've pressed them open. I'm going to give this a quick try on now, just to see how it's fitting. I am thinking that it's going to fit pretty well from the looks of it and the measurements that I took. The only thing that I may need to do is just nip in underneath the princess seam a little bit, because sometimes I find that this area can gape a little bit. But other than that, I'm fingers crossed, hopeful that the next time you see me I will be putting in the sleeves. I have just tried it on really quickly, and I didn't even bother kind of like pinning it into place the whole way up, because it fits really well. As I say, very lucky that the Vogue block is pretty good for me, with just the minor alterations of adding the length in, which I definitely needed. And I'm really glad that I lowered the neckline. The next thing that we're going to do is move over to step 19, which is with right sides together, pin sleeve into armhole, placing large circle at shoulder. The large circle is what I have transferred into a notch on my pattern piece, because it's going to match up with the shoulder seam. Adjust ease, baste and stitch. Stitch again 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance, trim close to stitching, press seam allowance, flat, turn seam towards sleeve. Okay, so I'm doing some of that but not all of it. Because we've fully lined this, I really like to bag the sleeve lining out. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be keeping my lining out of the way. We don't want to deal with this at the moment. I'm going to grab my sleeve, and we want to make sure that we've got the correct part of the sleeve going into the correct armhole. So this is the wrong one. So we've got the double notch here, the single notch here, which means we need the double notch there to match up, underarm seam, and then the single notch. So I'm going to get this pinned into place from the underarm seam, the single notch, the double notch, and then the large circle, or the notch that I cut in for the large circle, to the shoulder seam, and then I will pin all the way up to my gathering stitches. Once that's done, I can then work out how much gathering I'm going to try and concentrate at the top of my sleeve. So I'm going to get that done, and I will show you what it looks like. I also prefer to sew my sleeves in with the bodice under the feed dogs and the sleeve under the presser foot. I'm going to be pinning it in so that all of the pins are going to be on the sleeve side of the garment. So I'm going to get that done. I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so I have pinned up to the beginning of the gathering stitches, and I've made sure to pin the seam allowances open on the bodice. I should have mentioned we're pinning right sides together, so the right side of the sleeve is to the right side of the bodice. So as you can see, I added 2 inches of extra fullness onto this sleeve because that's my preference. So there's quite a lot of excess fabric here that needs to be gathered in. So I'm going to pull lightly on my gathering threads, and I'm going to concentrate the fullness towards the shoulder seam because, again, that's my preference of how I like my gathers, or how I like these kind of sleeves to look. Push all of that gathering right up to the sleeve cap, right up to the top. Pin that into place. If you don't like a concentration of gathers in the same way that I do, you can distribute the gathers across the entirety of the gathered section, but I just prefer like a little bit of extra poof at the sleeve cap. So that's what it's ended up looking like. So I'm going to sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to have the bodice towards the feed dogs, and I'm going to have the actual sleeve under the presser foot so that I can corral and make sure that I'm not like gathering or stitching in any of this excess fullness around this area. So I'm going to get that done and I'll show you what it looks like. I sewed that at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to leave it like that for now. We will be putting in a second line of stitching a little bit later, but I want to put in the other sleeve first. Something else I think you're going to be able to see is that the gathering stitching is either side of the actual construction stitching, and that's meant that the gathers have sat really nicely. I think you can see there because the bottom edge of the gathers that's to be stitched in is being corralled as well as the top edge. I have found in the past when the gathering stitches or the e-stitching is over and above the gathers that are to be sewn in, they can splay out and not be so pretty when you don't have them corralled underneath the stitching line. However, as I mentioned in the beginning when we started making the sleeves, if your fabric doesn't recover from having puncture holes made in it from sewing, then you do want to do a different method for gathering. So we can trim off, but we're not going to remove, but we can trim off the excess gathering threads now, and we'll just leave that sleeve as it is. That's what it's going to look like at the moment on the outside of the garment. So we want to repeat all of those steps on the other side with the other sleeve, again keeping the lining completely out of the way. So I'll get that sewn in, and then I'll show you how I like to bag out the armholes with the lining so you get a nice clean finish. And you could do that double line of stitching to reinforce everything, and you can also clip into your curves at the same time to give you extra movement in the armholes. Let me get the other one sewn in and then I'll show you all those tips. This is definitely starting to look like a dress, well, at least the top half of the dress. I've still got my sleeve linings flapping free, so I want to finish those off nicely. I am going to, with the wrong sides together, what I want to do is turn under the seam allowance at the, for example, the side seam, just so that you've got a reference point. We're going to turn that under by about 5/8 of an inch, and you want to pin it to the seam line that we have just stitched into place. And you kind of want to match things up, but you don't need to be too careful about it at this stage because we are just pinning things into place so that we can then reach through and pull things through so that we can bag it out without creating a Mobius loop. And this is my trick for bagging out anything. You want to pin it into the place that you want it to be when it's finished before you start pinning it right sides together to actually sew the seam, because if we pull this through, so I've literally just folded back the lining, this is where the pin is, you will end up having to sew around in a kind of loop here. So once you've reached through and grabbed that place that you've pinned, you want to hang on to the place you've pinned, and you're going to remove the pin but not your hand, so you're still holding on to everything. Then you're going to replace the pin so that the right sides are together, and this time you want to be really careful about matching up your seam allowances. And we're going to be sewing with the line of stitching that we've just done on top, because you want to be sewing over that line of stitching for a second time. So I've literally just moved the pin from the other side, and I've got the underarm or the side seam matching up with the side seam of the lining, and the sleeve is in between those two pieces. So we're going to go around and we are going to pin our sleeve into place the whole way around. So you match up your double notches, your single notch, your shoulder seam. It will get a little bit tight because you will have to sew that, you know, there is going to be part of the bodice in the way, but it is completely doable. So match up our princess seams, and I'm only matching up like, you know, big match points like princess seams and that at the moment, because we're going to refine things in a second. Going around the other way this time, I'm going to match up my single notch. And again, we're doing it with the seam that we've just sewn, so the outer fabric on top, so that you can see that line of stitching, because we're going to be stitching on top of it. At the shoulder seams, it's going to get a little bit tight, so we're going to just pull carefully. And again, you want to make sure that you're not catching anything in this line of, or pinning at the moment, that we do not want to get caught. So I've basically pinned from princess seam to princess seam. I am going to keep pulling this through very carefully. It is going to be tight. This is doable, but it is tight. You maybe want to try and do this in 2 passes, which is also totally possible, and probably what I'm going to do actually, because this is quite tight. The shoulder seams on this dress are quite small. Because you've got the original initial pins in place, you can't really get this wrong when you're pulling things through. And just make sure that you're not catching any of the fullness of the sleeve in this pinning. If you don't want to do this because you're worried you're going to catch things or like pin the wrong thing into place, you can totally hand stitch the lining into place around the armhole. That is a very valid option. The other option as well, if you don't want to bag out your lining, is you can French seam your sleeve in, and I have got a full tutorial on how to do that, and I will list that in the description as well. So just pinning the shoulder seam into place now. So I'm going to sew from the underarm seam to the shoulder seam, and then I'm going to redistribute everything so that I can sew the other side from the shoulder seam to the underarm seam. If it gets too bulky or it isn't behaving itself, backstitch, take the work out from under the machine and rearrange everything, pull things through, and then start stitching again, because it won't matter as long as you don't like go into the body of the garment. It won't matter if you backstitch. And we are stitching over 5/8 of an inch over that line of stitching that we have just done. Okay, so that definitely was awkward. There was one way that was easier. So pulling the garment through to the back made sewing up to the shoulder seam much easier than trying to pull it all the way through the front. We do have something else to do before we can call this finished, but I am going to pull everything through and just make sure that I haven't caught anything like the sleeve anywhere I don't want it to, or the lining anywhere I don't want it to, and I haven't. But you can see it's really tight and puckering, and that's not going to sit nicely if we left the garment like that. So what you want to do is reach back inside, and I would suggest that you do double check before you start doing this, because the next step is to trim off all of this excess allowance with your pinking shears. And obviously if you've caught something, like if you've caught the sleeve within the seam and you cut it with your pinking shears before you check, you can cut holes in your sleeve. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to go grab my pinking shears and I'm going to trim kind of 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching line. We've reinforced that stitching line because we've gone over it twice, so trimming away with your pinking shears will release all the tension as well and make the armhole sit really nicely. Let me grab my pinking shears, get this done. You want to be super careful when you're doing this and make sure that you don't cut anything that you don't want to, because it would be a pain in the proverbial to repair or replace the pattern piece if you do cut something that you shouldn't. So pinking shears to trim this off, and then we can do the same for the other side. Okay, so as you saw, that took a while and I needed to do 2 passes, but if I now turn this through, and obviously this has not been pressed yet, but the armhole is going to sit a lot flatter. It is all nicely finished. So the only thing that we have left to do now is take out the gathering stitches that we put into the sleeve cap when we started making the sleeve. So I'm just going to unpick these all the way around you can pull this through, but I do find that if you pull on threads like this, you can end up doing more damage to the fabric than if you just kind of like unpick it like this. Don't want to get anything snagged because obviously this is visible on the final garment. Okay, so I'm going to take that over to the ironing board and give that whole seam a press. That is the armhole neatly finished for the garment so that it looks pretty on the inside and the outside. Obviously I need to repeat that for this side. So the important part, again, I will stress, is pinning the seam allowance at the first instance so that you don't end up with a Mobius loop. So you want to take your underarm seam allowance here, turn it under by 5/8 of an inch and pin it to the corresponding seam on the bodice, and then you peel back the lining from the main body of the fabric. You grab the seam where you have pinned, holding onto it. You then take your pin out and repin with right sides together, matching up your seam allowances very precisely on this side. Pin it into place the whole way around, and then 5/8 of an inch over the previous line of stitching, probably in 2 or 3 passes, and then trim with your pinking shears. I have pressed the seams so everything is lying nice and flatly, and that means the bodice is complete for now. Right, so we need to move over to putting the skirt onto the bodice, but I have something that I need to do first. So I've been thinking about how I want to finish the centre back seam where the zip's going to go in. This is the zip that I've got that's closest in colour, and whilst it's an invisible zip, so the only thing that's really going to show is the pull, and I'm happy with the match of the pull to the outer of the fabric. If you have a look at it here, I think you can see that the zip is very visible through the fabric. Now, it's not the end of the world, it's not hugely bad, but the skirt is fully lined as per the pattern. So something that I can do, and I am going to do, is I'm going to baste my skirt lining to my outer around the waist, and then I'm going to treat them as one piece. So the zip will get sewn to the 2 layers of fabric rather than the 1. I'm still going to finish the bottom part of the seam underneath the zip independently so that the skirts are not attached the whole way down the centre back seam, because I don't want that, but I do want to hide the shadow of the zip under these layers of fabric. It's not my usual preference, but because of, like I say, the fabric I'm using, this is the way that I'm going to attempt to tackle that. So the other thing is, I have French seamed the lining and the skirt outer. Now usually I would put them wrong sides together so that the seams weren't showing on the inside of the skirt, and having a look at that, I'm very happy with how that looks. So I'm basically going to pin the waistline of the skirt outer to the lining at all of the important points. So the side seams, there's a couple of notches. I'm going to pin all the seams together, pin in between, and then I'm going to baste these 2 layers together at 3/8 of an inch, and that way I can then treat this as one piece of fabric, which will also hide my zipper tape when I get round to sewing that on. And I want to baste these into place first because these are both super shifty fabrics. I have used a viscose Marocaine for the lining, and obviously this is a poly georgette, poly chiffon, poly something, I think it's georgette, for the outer. So they're both very shifty, so rather than try and sew them, just pin them to the bodice together and then sew them together, I want to pin them to each other, baste them to each other, and then I can treat them as one and sew them to the bodice. So I'm going to get that done, pinned together and basted together at 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. I have sewn the waist seams together of the skirt pieces, and now I'm going to treat this as one piece of fabric. The reason I haven't interlined the skirt, I may have said this already, but just to reiterate, the reason I didn't interline the skirt is because I like the flow of this fabric. I didn't want to interfere with that, and I was using another fabric that will drop at a different rate on the bias, and I didn't want to end up with weirdly baggy parts of the fabric if I had sewn the, you know, all four sides to the interlining fabric. You can do it, and you can leave the bottom open so that you kind of sort the hem out and then stitch it together later, but I never think it looks particularly great, so that's why I haven't interlined this fabric for the skirt, for those reasons. But anyway, I'm going to take my skirt, I'm going to take my bodice, and with the lining of this one completely out of the way because we're doing something different with this lining, I'm going to match up all my notches. There's some notches on the center front of the bodice, and they'll match up with the center front skirt pieces. Match up my seams because theoretically I have made it so that my front seams match up with the princess seams, and they just about do. So match up my seams, match up my side seams, and I'm going to sew the skirt to the bodice at 5/8 of an inch the whole way around, and then I'm going to go and press everything up to the bodice side, and I'm also going to press the hem of the lining or the waistline of the lining over by 5/8 of an inch so I can slip stitch that into place a little bit later. It's definitely looking like a dress now, so I'm very pleased with how the skirt panel is meeting up with the bodice panel. I've sewn everything at 5/8 of an inch, and then I've pressed all of the seam allowance up into the bodice, and as I mentioned, I have pressed the seam allowance of the lining down by 5/8 of an inch so I can slip stitch that into place later. So the next thing that we need to do is put in the zip. So I use an invisible zipper foot which has these two grooves here that you can make sure that the teeth of your invisible zip, not so easy to do, but so they end up, the teeth end up sitting in one of those grooves. That rolls this out of the way so that you can get nice and close to the teeth to stitch it into place without actually stitching too close or too far away from the zipper. Okay, so I like to undo my zipper. As you know, I left that gap in the neckline from when we were sewing the lining in earlier, and that is so that I can put my zip right up to the raw edge of the top of my fabric. On an invisible zip, most commercial visible zips, there's obviously the little stopper, and if you measure from the stopper to the top of the invisible zip, you'll find that it's usually around about 6/8 or 3/4 of an inch. What I like to do is I will put the raw edge of my zip alongside the raw edge of the top of the bodice where I'm sewing the zipper in, and it's right side of zip to right side of fabric, making sure that that top edge is matching up. I tend to just put one pin in now. You can do your invisible zips in loads of different ways. I know some people like to baste them in. I tend to just do them with one pin so it's in place when I get started, so I can get the teeth into the groove of the presser foot and make sure that that's in place before I start stitching. But if you want to make sure that everything's going to go in correctly, you can baste this into place first. The important thing is when we get to the waist, you want to make sure that the seam allowance is still up, and as you know, we put the lining and the outer fabric in together. We want to sew our zip through both of those layers and treat those layers as if they are one layer of fabric. So we're going to be seeing the wrong side of the zip on the inside. It won't be sandwiched between the lining, it's going to be on top of the lining. When we turn the fabric under, it will end up looking like that. So I will list to a invisible zip tutorial in the description. I'm not going to show you any more detail on how I do mine because whenever I do, I always get referred back to this tutorial, which is a very different way of doing it, but it's a way that works really well. I just prefer my way of doing it, which is just something that I've gotten used to over the 11 years that I've been sewing. So I'm going to get my zip in and then I'll show you what we're going to do next. My zip is in and I am pretty happy with that. I haven't pressed it yet because I want to finish off the neckline. So I'm going to open the zip back up. I'm going to sandwich the zip between the lining and the outer and just finish that line of stitching 5/8 of an inch. Once I've done that, I'm then going to finish the understitching right to the edge of the lining as well. So I'm going to get that done for both sides and I'll show you what that looks like. I have finished off the neckline and I have understitched it. I haven't pressed it yet, but when I do, it's going to end up looking like this, and then the stopper is going to be at the top edge of the back of the neckline. Now you can do your zips in loads of different ways. Do it so that you end up with a gap so you can put a hook and eye in there. I don't like hooks and eyes, so I tend to do my zips in this manner, but yeah, very pleased with that. So now I need to work on closing up the back skirt, so I'm going to need to zip my zip up, and this fabric is fraying every 5 seconds. Cannot wait to get it all enclosed in a lining. So I'm going to, like I say, do these individually and separately. So I want to take just the outer portion of fabric, and this is going to be a little bit tricky to do, but it's going to be totally doable. So I'm going to take the outer portion of fabric and I'm going to pin that all the way down to the hem with the right sides together, and then I will use my regular zipper foot to sew that, and I'll show you what that looks like when I get to that point. Okay, so I have kept the lining out of the way and I have pinned the center back seam of the skirt together, and then with my regular zipper foot and the needle moved as far over and close to this previous stitching from the zip as I can get, I have back stitched at the top and then sewn at 5/8 of an inch the whole way down to secure this center back seam together. And then I'm going to do exactly the same for the lining, except that I'm going to have to leave a little bit more of a gap between the starting point of my stitching and where the zip finishes, because if I got as close to the end of the stitching here, I'd be stitching through the outer fabric. This also means that when I open this seam up, it's going to be this seam splayed open on the inside of the lining, which is not how it would usually be finished, but as you saw, we're treating this as one piece. So basically I'm doing the same thing, which is matching up the centre back seam of the skirt lining. I'm going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch from around the bottom of the zip. You can kind of see where the outer fabric is. I want to avoid that at all costs. I don't want to catch that at all. So I'll be starting my stitching for this lining at around about 1.25 inches down from where the zip is sewn in. Again, I shall just sew that at 5/8 of an inch from that point and to the hem. I'll show you what this all looks like when I am done. The outer base of my zip looks like this. Again, nothing has been pressed. And then the inner part, I've got this seam to press open, and then there's a little gap there in the lining, which is what we want, and then got this one to press open as well. So that's what the inner visible part of the dress is going to look like. Outer fabric is being fed through the little gap that we've left in the lining. As you saw, you can't really tell that on the outside, but again, none of this has been pressed. So before I do take everything to be pressed, the next thing that I want to do is finish off the lining of the bodice. So I'm going to fold the lining back on itself along the zip, and I'm going to pin that into place. So I'm going to stitch 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, making sure that I am sandwiching and capturing the zipper tape, so maybe 1/2 inch. But you don't want to be sewing right up against the zipper teeth, because if you do, you will interfere with the ability of the pull to get up and down past the lining. So I'm going to pin this into place and stitch that into place at 3/8 of an inch with my regular zipper foot. Then I will do the same for the other side, then we can turn it through and press everything. I have sewn the lining to the centre back seam, basically enclosing the zip. There is a lot of bulk in this corner, but before I clip that bulk out, I do just want to turn everything through and make sure that the zip runs and that everything lines up, because if you clip it too prematurely and you need to adjust things, you don't want to have to be unpicking stuff that has been clipped really close. Fingers crossed. The zip runs. Again, nothing's been pressed, so it will run cleaner once the lining has been pressed. And yeah, I'm happy with how the top edge of that is meeting up with all that bulk in there. So I'm going to unzip again, turn this through back on itself, and I want to trim off the excess bulk at the top here. So we're going to be kind of taking off that sort of diagonal and then trimming off the excess like that, which means that when we turn it back through, it will all sit a lot cleaner and neater at the top than it did before. Yeah, this side is still, so you can see there's a lot more bulk in this bit up here than there is in this one. So when we press it again, get everything to lie nice and flatly, and that will be great. So I'm going to just trim this other one, and then I can go and press all of those seams that I've done, and then we can slip stitch the lining to the waist seam. Now that everything is pressed, I have pinned the folded and pressed under edge of the bodice lining to the waist seam, and I'm going to slip stitch that in place from zipper edge to zipper edge. Then the dress will be as done as we can do for a while, until I've given it, say, a week to let the hem drop on the bias, and so I can level that out and finish the hem. So yeah, I'm going to get this slip stitched into place and then let the dress hang.
I let my dress hang for a full week before I even looked at the hem, and as predicted, the lining fabric had dropped slightly more on the bias than the outer fabric, but both had dropped in the areas of the hem that did have bias in them. My favourite method for levelling a hem is to lay it out on the table as you see here, use my tape measure to find the shortest level of the hem, which is usually the centre back seam or the centre front seam, especially if they are cut on the fold like this one is. Once I have determined what the shortest length of the skirt is, in this instance it was 29.5 inches, I had added 3 inches of length to the original pattern skirt length because this length is a preference of mine. I then went round and smoothed the fabric down from the waist, used my tape measure flush against the waist seam and made a mark either side of the 29.5 inch measurement on the tape measure directly onto the outer fabric. The important part of this technique is to really smooth the fabric down. Fabrics, when they're lying flat like this, can kind of revert back to the original shape that they were, so you really want to make sure that you are smoothing the fabric before you put your mark in. So I've gone round and done that on the outer fabric at 29.5 inches the whole way around. Then I can take my scissors out and cut away all of the excess fabric that has dropped on the bias, and it's a good couple of inches in places and barely anything in others. Once I've done the outer fabric, I can then turn the dress the other way around and use the exact same method to level the hem for the lining. This one I know is a particularly stretchy fabric, and I know from past experience that even a week of hanging is not always enough to ensure a level hem for the longevity of the garment. So in this instance, I am smoothing out the fabric and making a mark at 29 inches, which is half an inch shorter than the outer fabric. I'm going the whole way around and I'm really making sure to really smooth that fabric down from the waist to the hem before I make my mark. This method is okay for me. I do have fairly large hips in comparison to the rest of my body, but I don't find that I end up with a hem that is shorter at the back, basically where my bum is kind of protruding more than, for example, my stomach does at the front. I don't find that this gives me an uneven hem with all the lumps and bumps I have below the waist. However, if you are worried about this method resulting in a hem that is shorter in places than others because of the curvature of your body, you might want to enlist the help of a sewing friend, or possibly invest in a mannequin. Bootstrap do an amazing program where you can put your measurements in and get a mannequin made exactly to your measurements, so that you can place your garment on your dress form and measure up from the floor rather than from the waist, so that you end up with an even hemline from the floor, which will give you a hemline that is perhaps longer in certain areas than others, but when it's being worn on your body, it is looking even and level with the floor. I have an entire video about leveling hems. It is a little tongue-in-cheek, and I do say that this is my favourite method because it's easy, you don't need any special equipment, and you don't have to have a sewing friend to help you with this. But like I say, if you end up with slightly wonky hems because of your curvaceous nature, you may wish to look into other hem levelling methods.
Okay, so you all just saw me leveling the hem on the outer and lining parts of the skirt, and now I need to finish those off. So I'm going to use my bias binding for the outer hem. So this is the centre back seam, and I'm going to do a very similar thing to the way I finished off the hem of the sleeves. I'm going to unwrap some of my binding and put it in my lap, and I'm going to give myself like a 2-inch tail, and I'm going to start around 2 inches away from the centre back seam because I don't want to be creating another seam in the binding when I finish off the end right over all the bulk from the centre back seam and the binding on the centre back seam. So about 2 inches away, 2-inch tail, 2 inches away from the centre back seam. I'm just going to put a pin in because this stuff is a little shifty. I only pin the beginning to just get it under the presser foot, and then the rest of the time I will just leave the roll of binding in my lap and feed it from there. I'm going to sew all the way around until I get about to the 2-inch tail that I've left here, and I will backstitch there, and then I'll cut off another 2-inch tail so that I've got enough fabric or bias binding left to do a mitered join, which I will show you in just a second. So I'm going to sew the whole way around, right side of bias binding to the right side of the skirt, 2-inch tail left free, 2 inches away from the centre back seam, backstitch at the beginning and sew all the way around. I have got the bias binding sewn the entire way around the hem, and so I'm going to cut this off, giving myself like a good couple of inches to work with. We've got probably 2.5, 3-inch gap there. So what I want to do is open up the bias binding so it's nice and flat, turn it on a 45-degree angle, and again start trying to finger press a crease. It doesn't need to be super defined, I just need a little bit of a crease. And then I'm going to take this bit of the bias binding, open that out flat. This is much easier to do with a fabric that holds a crease. Butt that up against that previous crease so it's creating like a mitered join between the two fabrics, or it will create a mitered join between the two fabrics. So I'm going to take a pin, and there's a minuscule amount of crease there. Match up those markings that I've put in, pin it together carefully and see how that is lying, and that's not too bad. So I'm going to sew these two ends of the bias binding together along that 45-degree angle that I have pinned into the fabric to join those together. But before I cut anything, I will just come back and double check to make sure that I have got it fitting nicely and it's either not too big or not too tight. Although you want to err on the side of too tight because it's bias binding, so it has inherent stretch in it, as I explained when I did this for the hem of the sleeve. So I'm going to sew in that seam, that 45-degree seam, which is there. Then we'll come back and have a look and see how I have done for getting it to be the right size. Okay, so I have sewn in that line of stitching at 45-degree angle so that the join is now the same as all the other joins in the bias binding, and if I hold the hem taut with the binding you can see that it all lines up nicely. So I will trim off all this excess seam allowance, and I much prefer to work with a large amount of excess seam allowance and trim it down later than work with like 1/4 of an inch, which is what I'm trimming this down to, and then have a really fiddly time of trying to make it all line up properly. Trim those little extra pieces off. I'm going to finish sewing the bias binding to the hem and that little gap that's left, and then we can go and press. And what I will do first is I will press the seam allowance down into the bias binding, so the bias binding is going to be down like that, and then from the wrong side I'll press the seam allowance down into the binding just to give that edge hopefully a little bit of crispness. This will take quite a while because this is a polyester fabric, so I'm going to need to use my clapper, not too much heat because I don't want to melt this fabric, especially now. And once I have got that whole hem given a crisp edge, I will then fold the bias binding back completely and go around and press it again, and that initial line of pressing is going to help us get this nice and crisp crisp along the edge. Once that's done, I can then slip stitch the bias binding into place for a somewhat invisible hem finish, and then we can move on to a narrow rolled hem for the lining. I have slip stitched my bias binding into place, and I'm going to give it another press because it's still really bouncy, even though I took my time pressing it, used my clapper until the heat and the steam had cooled in the fabric, and yeah, it's still bouncy, but it is what it is. I have also sewn a line of stitching 5/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of my lining, and I'm going to go and press that up now so that I can then sew another line of stitching across the fold and trim off the excess, and that will be the start of my narrow rolled hem for my lining, which will all be machine stitched because it's not going to be seen. So I'm going to go and do a lot of pressing, and I will be back to show you the next step of the narrow rolled hem. I have pressed under the hem of my lining, and I've pressed it so it's on the inside of the lining. I'm now going to go around and sew 1/8 of an inch away from that folded edge so that it's all secured into place, and then I can just trim off the excess seam allowance so that I can then turn it up again. I'm doing it this way because this is a curved hem, and this is my favourite finishing technique for a curved hem if I'm not using bias binding. So I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from that folded line and then trim off the excess, press again and sew again, but again I'll show you as I go. I've gone round and stitched 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, like from the folded edge, like I said I was going to, and I'm now trimming off the excess. So I'm leaving 1/16, just under 1/8 of an inch of fabric left next to that line of stitching. Once I've trimmed all the excess off, I'm going to go and press it again so I get a nice narrow rolled hem, and then stitch over that visible line of stitching to finish this off. You can do it with just pressing, but for me, I prefer this step of stitching this fold into place. I just find it a little easier to do it this way. I've also did my initial line of stitching at 5/8 of an inch so that the hem of the lining will really be shorter than the hem of the dress. When I trimmed the hem of the dress, I did it at 29.5 inches. When I trimmed the lining, I did it at 29 inches. I just really want to make sure that this hem doesn't peek out, because in my experience, this fabric can continue to drop on the bias for like months after it's been initially hemmed, and obviously I don't have months to finish this dress for the sew along. So yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that this hem is at least kind of 3/4 of an inch shorter than the hem of the main body of the dress. But I'm going to get the rest of this trimmed away and then pressed up and sewn into place, and then the dress will be finished. So I've done my final line of stitching and I have got a nice narrow rolled hem. I am going to go and give this a final press, and then the dress is finished. I really hope you've enjoyed this sew along. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to answer them. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I will be doing a full review of this pattern once I've made a few more. I won't be changing anything that I've done in this sew along for the fit or construction methods, except for perhaps maybe not interlining a fabric if it doesn't need it. But I will be tweaking the pattern by adding different sleeves and different skirts onto it. That's something I absolutely love about sewing your own wardrobe, is that you can smoosh different elements onto a bodice that fits you well and end up with wildly different looking dresses. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.